Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 6th Sunday after the Epiphany for the week of February 16th, 2025. And I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I'm excited because of the contrast that we're going to have this week. Last week, we were on the cutting edge. We were talking about AI. And this week, we're going to be talking about paleontology and dinosaurs and people and mammals within that. So this is one of the things that I really enjoy about the podcast is because of science being such a broad subject. It gives us a lot of flexibility to be able to work within that. And especially with where we're going this week within the text, I think it gives us some insight potentially into looking at these texts from a different lens, a different perspective. And I think, again, it helps us look at our own faith life and corporately as a faith life. How does this kind of change our perspective on how we're looking at things? But before we get to that, we have to look back to last week's questions, which were, are you sticking to what you have known, or are we being challenged ourselves to move forward? And are we challenging ourselves in our faith? And I think this is something that one of the loyal listeners kind of responded with the idea of, it takes wisdom and insight to be able to see it. Recognizing that there's going to be things that are continuing to evolve and change. And as we continue to go through life, recognizing that God is in and amongst that. And we may not fully understand it in the moment, but recognizing that God's still working it and trying to do these amazing things with it. And I think when we then look in the review mirror, the further we get from it, we start seeing maybe more of the picture of what it is. And I think that's difficult at times for us to be able to recognize that God is active in doing things, but yet we aren't necessarily seeing it or sensing it or recognizing it in the moment. And I think it does take a lot of time and wisdom for us to recognize and see it more and more in the present and the future. But then recognize that when we look in the review mirror, there may have been things we still missed. And I think that's part of this whole faith walk, is trying to slowly get and see how all these pieces come together, and recognizing that there's going to be still plenty of things that God does that we don't even recognize until long after the fact. And I think that's part of the growth. That's part of the challenge. And that's part of why we need to continue to evolve as well. Allowing God to continue to steer us to evolve and to be the people that we are called into being. So let's just jump into it this week. The Old Testament reading is out of Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 to 10. This then is a wisdom text talking about how we often as humans rely on our own strength. And that when we do that, we often will end up falling short. And these are the times that we will run dry. These are the times then that things disintegrate, that there's just no root system because it's purely dependent on us and we're not looking around to see what else there is. And it's compared in verse 6 to a shrub in the desert where there's nothing else there. But those who trust in the Lord, it's like a tree planted by water and sending that out into the stream so that even when those dry times come, there's still moisture that's running by to be able to pull up and to help the tree survive and still be able to potentially bear fruit. The psalm that goes with this is Psalm 1, all 6 verses of it. And we see again this stream analogy being talked about here. But again, this idea of who are we going to put our trust in? Are we going to put it in man, or are we going to put it in the Lord? And recognizing that as we spend more time with the Lord, we then are better able to interpret what that actually means and what does that actually look like. And in doing that, it allows us to actually put down roots. Compared to if we're depending on the ways of this world, it's like chaff that gets blown away. There's no real substance to it. And recognizing that we are striving to continue to filter out the noise, to hear what God is calling us into, to be able to put down those roots. The New Testament text or epistle text this week then is out of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 12 to 20. This is the people of Corinth and Paul kind of chewing them out a little bit here, that there are people who are questioning the resurrection. And especially coming off of last week where there's this discussion that there are still plenty of people who are living at this period of time who witnessed the resurrection. And how it's being twisted at this moment where it's like, yes, Jesus was raised from the dead, but it wasn't a true resurrection. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't. And this is where, what are you talking about? Paul is stating. If we're misinterpreting this and saying that this wasn't a resurrection, what is the point of this whole faith then? It's the recognition that God is willing to lay down God's own life to have this relationship with us. And if that isn't actually happening, what is the point of this whole thing? And recognizing that our hope then is in that resurrection, and recognizing that through that resurrection, it provides life for us, being that we are able to be in closer relationship with God's own self. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 26. So this is another moment here where Jesus has gathered a crowd and he has done some healing and casting out of unclean spirits, and people are wanting to be around him. And then we get into verse 20, where it says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, revile you, defame you on the account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." This idea of, again, of woe being translated more as like, watch out. And this contrast plays with our head. It plays with what we typically understand here as we go through these last 6 verses. This idea of the low being lifted up and the haughty, the people in power, being humbled some. And recognizing that in life there is this cycle, I think, is also something that Jesus is pointing out. But I would also argue, I think there's a little bit more here, that as people and when we're looking at things and thinking about things, I think there's some good insight that Jesus is trying to provide into how the earth in and of itself was designed. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some different ideas and direction, and there's some great commentaries over there. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, but most importantly, having a daily devotion. If we're spending a half an hour each week listening and digging into the Word, preparing for Sunday morning, I think it's vital for us to also be making sure that we're doing some type of devotion and making sure that we're connecting in that way. So if you haven't checked that out, coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that as well. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection covering a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, covering the weekly text much like this week after week, or you could also sign up or additionally sign up for the monthly newsletter, which also then covers some additional events and some ecological ideas that potentially bringing in. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy these resources. So make sure to check those out. Those will be the first link down in the show notes. Blessed are you, woe to you. These are sometimes difficult for us, and especially coming in the 21st century, and especially as being a person in the United States, a lot of the woes should be applying to myself, because in a lot of ways I am in a very privileged position. And so that means that I need to be able and willing to take these woes to heart. But I would also argue, I think one of the things that Jesus is actually trying to do here is give a little bit of a history lesson. Because I think, as I kind of teased earlier, Jesus is trying to help us understand how the foundations of this globe, how the foundations of this place have been laid. And for us to be able to understand that and grasp that, I think gives us an understanding and allows us to understand how we need to continue to evolve and change as well. Because if we don't evolve and change, we might just then become extinct. So let's jump into this a little bit. I was thinking about this, and the thing that jumped into my head is before mammals took over the world, and if you want to look at it, mammals are probably the predominant species, especially since we are mammals on the globe at this current moment. And in a lot of ways, we control a lot of things with that because we are this dominant species. But it wasn't always that way. Before, there were dinosaurs, reptiles that were controlling and kind of running the world. And if we look into that history, I think it gives us a little bit of insight here. So I'll attach a really good hour-long discussion from paleontologist Steve Bruschetta, who is talking about the rise and reign of mammals that he had come out with as a book, coming from the Royal Institute, coming over from the UK. Great stuff. I'd highly recommend checking that out, especially if you have any interest in dinosaurs or early life here on the planet. And one thing that I will also state right up here up front is I will be taking from more of a scientific standpoint with this section. Whether you believe in young Earth or old Earth models, I still think there's a lot that you can get out of this. So my time frames that I will be using are old Earth models, but again, I think still listen through this and kind of maybe recognize the pattern that is going on here at minimum, and using that to help shape where we'll be going here in just a moment. So we have to start with the Carniforma period, which is where we have a lot of our coal swamps. And at this period of time, the world was much different. We had early primitive trees. It was very swampy, but it was also very rich in oxygen. And so that's where when we get some of these really big like millipedes or really big like dragonflies, they are presumed from this period of time. And at this period of time, there is a split that we go through that separates the beginnings of the separation of mammals from reptiles. And this is called synapsis species. There is multiple different ones. And how they are being defined is that there was an eye socket like we have today. And behind that eye socket, there was another hole. And this allowed for more muscles to be able to start to run so that you had a more powerful bite. This wasn't a true mammal yet, but this was the beginnings of evolving away from our reptilian ancestors, where we have a common ancestor. So there was a divergence there. And when this started happening, they were having success. They were starting to evolve and really had some really cool things that were going on. And this was about 325 million years ago. We then move into the Perminade period, and there is a lot of these synapse speciation really starts to diversify. We start noticing within the fossil record that the teeth are also starting to differentiate from our reptiles. At this point, there's starting to be early signs of specialization within teeth, kind of like how we have canines and molars and incisors, that there's different roles. Think of it like a Swiss Army knife is how Steve Bruschetta kind of put it within our mouth. This is the beginnings of that. This was going great. We were starting to have some carve out, and we were having actually a great amount of diversification until 252 million years ago, when these super volcanoes kind of took over and started erupting in Russia, much bigger than anything that we have seen in modern times. And this kind of caused a lot of global warming and climate change, and 95% of all speciation was suddenly wiped out. Boom, gone. There were some survivors, though, of these early mammalian speciation, partially because we had started to figure out how to burrow was one of the things. And there were some that had hair, which then helped with some temperature regulation, along with we were fast producers. We were able to reproduce quickly. And in doing that, we were able to have some survivors to get through this mass extinction period. And this moved us into the Jurassic period, which is the beginnings of where more commonly we look at with dinosaurs. And dinosaurs became very large and were controlling the very large space. But then mammals at that same time were also still around. We just dominated the small space. And this happened around 225 million years ago. We were tiny, but we had started to have a fused jaw. It used to have multiple different bones there, but they had all fused together to make a stronger jaw. We then had started to make actual milk production. And so this is when we're looking at and starting to become kind of more, again, closer and closer to mammals. Mammals produce milk. Some of these jaw bones that we had fused moved up into our ears, which allowed for us to have much better hearing. And we noticed during this period, then the brain sizes started getting bigger, along with our olfactory bulbs. So thus we were able to smell and had more intelligence. And we were thriving in the niche that we were. We were controlling the small mammal area. Dinosaurs were big, we were small. Thinking of niches within an environment, we were controlling those. And in fact, there has been fossilized mammals that were shown the last meal that they had was baby dinosaurs. We were controlling that small space. But near the end of the Cretaceous period, and this is when there was a 6-mile wide asteroid that crashed into Earth, the only things that really survived were birds and us. And in fact, we figure again, 90% of mammals died. The ones that survived, again, were because we burrow, like we had earlier, where we still had some hair and fur. We were fast growing. We ate a diverse diet. We were diversified really well, and we were still really small. And with the dinosaurs being gone after that, it allowed for us to grow as a mammalian species and start growing much, much bigger. At this same period of time, the Earth, all the different continents have been linked together, and it's around this period of time that they start breaking apart as well, which then allows for some different speciation that's going to be happening a little bit further down the line here, but at the beginning of specialized speciation. So up to this point, to 150 million years ago, really we don't have any mammals that were bigger than what a badger is today. We were a badger size and smaller. Then in the next few 100 million years, we suddenly get to pig size. And then 1 to 2 million years ago, suddenly we start getting to cow size and bigger. And we also recognize during this evolution period where we're having mammals get bigger and bigger, we also start having placenta mammals. Thus, they are giving live birth to well-developed young. Now, with this all happening, there has been a few current survivors of previous generations of mammals. So we have 5 of the monotropes, which are egg-laying mammals. So the most probably familiar one of those are platypus. And then we have the marsupials, which there's about 380 species of those, where you have live birth to really, really small young. And then there's a pouch to be able to help them. So thinking koalas, kangaroos, you could think possums or opossums. They are all marsupials that are allowing for this to happen. And with them happening, it allowed for us to continue to develop faster. And this is where we enter the Eocene era. We start seeing some more of the modern mammals. We start getting actually the first worldwide mammals of bats. Being able to evolve wings allowed them to be able to actually be the first, like, really, truly worldwide species. And we then start seeing, like, different evolution happening as, yes, getting wings, but also whales moving from on-land species over generations into the water and losing their limbs to be able to walk on land. We also then, because of how the continents are breaking up, we start seeing unique speciation, such as where we have elephants starting more in the African, and then as it joined with the Asian subcontinent being able to, and India being able to then have those be able to migrate through that region, where you had more sloths and different things in South America, because it was its own island at one point, along with Australia. So some unique speciation that started happening there because, again, the dinosaurs are not there. 2.5 million years ago, we have an ice age. Boom, that again kind of changes things drastically, but it gives the rise to megafauna at that same point. So we have our mastodons and these huge speciation at this point. And again, changing things around us. And I found a fun fact with this. Thomas Jefferson, the week after being announced as Vice President of the United States, actually presented a scientific paper talking about megafauna. Our founding fathers and people of that generation were very aware of megafauna and found it very, very fascinating. And thus it moves into where we are today, where, as we could say, mammals in general, us as Homo sapiens are actually controlling and impacting mammals more than any other time on the face of the planet. And based off of how we are interacting with the world, it's actually having direct impact on mammals themselves. So why do I go through that history? The thing that I recognize when we are going through this history is we have rises and falls. You get the rise of dinosaurs and then they fade away to nothing. We have multiple times where different phases of mammals where, we're starting to get some, we have a drop off of 90%. We're having huge diversification, drop off of 90%, 95%. But what had to keep happening? You had to keep evolving. You had to keep changing. You had to be aware of what was going on and recognizing that we need to continue to evolve with it. There were plenty of times where the dinosaurs were in great position. They were the dominant species. They were the ones that Jesus is saying, whoa, you who are full now, you will become hungry. When the asteroid hit and the climate changed because of the lack of diversification of their diet, they didn't make it. They died. So this idea of there are cycles to how this world works. And I think we have to be open to that. I think we have to recognize that, yes, there's rises and falls within climate, but also take responsibility that we've gotten to the point where we are near the top right now. And that might mean that there might be a time where things fall back, and we have to be aware of that. And that might mean that we have to be more considerate of those who are hungry now. Maybe not just humans. Maybe it's other speciation as well. And recognizing how can they be filled? Where can we recognize the ones who are hurting so that we can help them laugh again? Where can we recognize the people who are hating the different speciation and that are reviled, that we can make sure that they are blessed and recognized for the abilities and things that they're doing? I think within that, when we're doing that, it allows us to humble ourselves to recognize that we aren't the biggest thing ever. There's wisdom within that. Because when you humble yourself it allows you to actually learn. It's a lot of times that you have to quiet yourself and have to be observant to really be able to see things, to really be able to hear things. And isn't that what we're getting out of the text here in Jeremiah and the Psalm? To recognize that? And in doing that we are able to then recognize and acknowledge the wisdom of people who've come before us. Recognize the speciation of species that have been here much longer than us and the wisdom of what they've been able to carve out and recognizing that. But that only is heard if we take the time to actually hear it. I think this gospel is really Jesus giving the pattern on how God laid out the world. Recognizing that there's these rises and falls, not just within people, but within how God created this whole world. And to not get full of yourself. To not get to the point where you are seeing yourself as greater than. Because if you are, you're setting yourself up for potential failure. And I think in a world in which we're in, I think that's one of the things that we are struggling with. Is being part of a first world nation. I think one of the things that as a global community coming from a first world nation or as a nation, I think one of the things that we're struggling with is not putting ourselves ahead of other people and saying that we're better than. Recognizing that we are all Homo sapiens at the end of the day. We are all mammals at the end of the day. We are all on the same earth at the end of the day. And how do we take care of it? How do we recognize that? Earlier today, I actually went out to try to go birding, and it was not the most successful day for me. There were times I took too much time and missed opportunities of seeing a life bird for me, a boreal owl. Someday I'll see that. There were times where I just didn't probably take enough walks outside to really be able to hear and absorb and listen. There were times where I came off looking back and reflecting as privileged. As I drove around just expecting to see things just along the roadways and doing no real work to go and find things, to go and listen, to really hear. And in certain ways it stunk. But in certain ways it's also, that's me recognizing now, that's the woe. That's me expecting that things should be this way and they should be easy for me. And sometimes I think God really does want us to explore, to spend time, to listen. And in those times, then you might see things. I think a lot of times in the world of convenience that many people within these first world nations are at, we don't do that. And we expect it just to be there in front of us. And if we don't have it, then it's a problem. And I think then there's an aspect of then we are putting God up on a shelf and we don't utilize it. We don't utilize this faith. We aren't recognizing it. We aren't giving it the time to actually have it speak to us. We are doing our own interpretation instead of actually spending time with the one who is trying to have the relationship with us. And I think when we look through history, as Jesus was maybe trying to point out here, that's the value of it and recognizing it and trying to evolve and continue to recognize that this is a relationship that God is going for. And if we lose sight of that, things happen and change very quickly, and suddenly, bang, what you knew doesn't work anymore. So the question I have for you this week is, where can history help inform our growth? Where can history help inform our growth? Because I think when we actually acknowledge history and acknowledge the wisdom that's there, that is when we can actually start to really grow. And I think it allows for us to recognize that there's the waters there to help us grow because the history has happened and it helps us prepare, helps us realize that when those hard times are coming or happening, that it's not the be-all, end-all. That we haven't put ourselves in a position like the bush that's in the desert that we need the perfect conditions in order for us to make it. Instead, we have planted ourselves along a bank with water that's going to continue to flow even in the times of drought so that we are able to thrive even in those times. Maybe in a different way, maybe not in the way we expected, maybe we're not giving off much fruit, but we're still able to survive. And I think that's a hard thing for us to acknowledge and to think about and know that things change. We like things stagnant. We like being able to go back to something and feel like we can hold on to it. But I think as we really study Jesus's ministry, that's not how things work. We have to be willing and able to evolve and change with it. And in that, I think we actually get more glimpses of who God is. And we are able to better recognize where God is calling us and better recognize what is all happening around us. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.